Listen carefully. Nothing outside you has as much power over your life as the conversation happening inside your own mind. Not your past, not other people, not luck. Every day, your thoughts are either quietly pulling you toward clarity and peace or slowly dragging you into suffering. Buddhism is brutally honest about this. There is no enemy more dangerous than an undisciplined mind, and no ally more powerful than a trained one. Most people think positive thinking means pretending everything is fine. That is false. Buddhism never teaches denial. It teaches awareness. Your mind does not save you by lying to you. It saves you by seeing clearly. And when it doesn't, it destroys you slowly, through habits of thought you don't even question. Right now, as you listen, your mind is already choosing a direction. Let's make sure it's the right one. 1. The mind creates suffering before life does. Buddhism starts with an uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. Life does not hurt you as much as your mind does. Pain is real, but suffering is manufactured. The difference matters because pain is unavoidable, while suffering is optional. Most people confuse the two and then spend their entire lives fighting the wrong enemy. When something difficult happens, the event itself is usually simple. A word is spoken, a plan fails, a person leaves, a body gets tired. That is the raw experience. But the mind rarely leaves it there. It rushes in with interpretation. It says this should not have happened. It means something about you. It will never get better. Someone is to blame. You are defective. The future is ruined. None of these things are part of the event. They are additions. This is why two people can go through the same situation and emerge completely differently. One adapts and continues. The other collapses and stays trapped. The difference is not strength, intelligence, or luck. It is how the mind processes what happened. Buddhism calls this process mental fabrication. The mind takes a neutral or painful event and builds an entire story around it, then suffers inside that story as if it were reality. Think about how long suffering lasts compared to the event that triggered it. An argument may last 10 minutes. The resentment can last 10 years. A mistake may take seconds. The self-judgment can follow you for a lifetime. Life moves on quickly. The mind does not. This is where positive thinking is often misunderstood. Buddhism does not tell you to pretend nothing hurts. It does not tell you to smile through pain or deny reality. That kind of positivity is fragile and dishonest. Real positive thinking in Buddhism is the ability to see clearly without adding unnecessary poison. When something unpleasant happens, the untrained mind reacts automatically. It labels the experience as unfair, personal, permanent, or unbearable. These labels feel true in the moment, but they are assumptions. The mind rarely asks whether they are accurate. It just repeats them until they feel like facts. This is unfair, assumes the world owes you a specific outcome. This is personal, assumes everything revolves around you. This is permanent, assumes the future is fixed. This is unbearable, assumes you are weaker than you actually are. None of these assumptions are proven. They are habits, and habits can be changed. Buddhism teaches that the first step toward freedom is noticing this process as it happens. You begin to observe the mind the same way you would observe weather. A storm appears. It feels intense. It passes. You don't blame the sky. You don't identify as the storm. You don't assume it will last forever. You understand its nature. The same applies to thoughts. A painful thought appears. Instead of following it, arguing with it, or suppressing it, you notice it. You see that it is a reaction, not a command. This alone creates space. And in that space, suffering weakens. The shift from "this ruined me" to "this is happening" may sound small, but it is radical. "This ruined me" turns an event into an identity. It freezes you in the past and projects pain into the future. "This is happening" brings you back to the present moment, where you still have breath, awareness, and choice. The present moment is always less unbearable than the story about it. Most suffering lives in memory and imagination. Regret pulls you backward. Fear pulls you forward. Very little suffering exists right now, unless you invite it with thought. Buddhism emphasizes the present not because it is magical, but because it is manageable. You can only deal with what is here. The rest is mental noise. Another reason the mind creates suffering is its addiction to control. The mind wants reality to follow its preferences. When reality doesn't cooperate, the mind tightens, resists, and complains. This resistance is experienced as suffering. The more you demand that life be different, the more you suffer. Acceptance in Buddhism does not mean liking what happens. It means acknowledging what is happening without fighting it internally. The fight is what exhausts you. When the fight stops, energy returns. Clarity returns. Action becomes possible again. This is why people who accept difficult situations often recover faster than those who resist them. Acceptance does not weaken you. It stabilizes you. From stability, intelligent response becomes possible. Positive thinking, then, is not about replacing negative thoughts with fake positive ones. It is about seeing thoughts as thoughts. When you stop believing every story your mind tells, suffering loses its foundation. The mind also tends to personalize everything. If something goes wrong, it assumes it says something about your worth. Buddhism directly challenges this. Events arise from countless causes and conditions, most of which have nothing to do with you. When you stop taking everything personally, emotional pain drops dramatically. Another hidden source of suffering is comparison. The mind constantly measures your life against imagined alternatives. I should be further. Others have it easier. This shouldn't be happening to me. Comparison creates dissatisfaction, even in stable conditions. Buddhism teaches contentment not as complacency, but as freedom from constant mental measurement. When the mind stops comparing, life feels lighter without changing externally. Training the mind to reduce suffering is not a one-time insight. It is a daily practice. You will still react. You will still feel pain. The difference is that you recover faster. You catch the story earlier. You don't spiral as deeply or stay trapped as long. Over time, you realize something important. The mind that once created suffering can also end it. The same tool that hurt you becomes the tool that saves you. Life will continue to present challenges. That is unavoidable. But whether those challenges turn into prolonged suffering depends largely on how your mind meets them. When you understand this, you stop fighting life and start training the mind. And that is where real peace begins. 2. Negative thoughts are habits, not truths. One of the most damaging mistakes people make is believing that their thoughts are telling them the truth. Buddhism is direct about this. Thoughts are not reliable narrators of reality. They are conditioned responses. They arise based on past experiences, repetition, fear, and habit. Treating them as facts is how the mind quietly destroys you. A thought appears in your mind and says, "I'm not good enough." Most people don't question it. They assume it must be true because it feels real. But feelings are not evidence, they are reactions. That thought didn't appear because it was proven. It appeared because it has been practiced before. Buddhism teaches that the mind is like a path in a forest. The more you walk a certain route, the clearer it becomes. Negative thinking works the same way. If you repeatedly think in terms of failure, blame, fear, or self-attack, those mental paths become automatic. Eventually, the mind walks them without asking for permission. This is why negative thoughts often feel involuntary. You didn't sit down and choose to think them. They simply showed up. But what you don't choose consciously, you have often trained unconsciously. The danger begins when you confuse habit with truth. Just because a thought appears frequently does not mean it is accurate. It only means it has momentum. Buddhism emphasizes this distinction because freedom depends on it. You cannot free yourself from something you believe is true, but you can weaken a habit once you recognize it as a habit. Positive thinking, in the Buddhist sense, does not mean replacing negative thoughts with blind optimism. It means changing your relationship to thought itself. Instead of asking, "Is this thought comforting?" you ask, "Is this thought skillful? Does it reduce suffering or does it multiply it?" Most negative thoughts fail this test immediately. The mind often speaks in absolutes: always, never, everyone, no one. These are not descriptions of reality. They are signs of emotional thinking. When the mind is calm, it speaks precisely. When it is agitated, it exaggerates. "This always happens to me. I'll never recover from this. No one understands me." These statements feel convincing, but they collapse under scrutiny. Buddhism trains you to observe this exaggeration without arguing with it. You don't need to fight the thought, you just need to see it clearly. The moment you see a thought as a mental event rather than a command, its grip weakens. Another critical insight from Buddhism is that thoughts do not need to be eliminated to lose their power. Trying to suppress negative thoughts often makes them stronger. Resistance gives them energy. Awareness drains it. When you notice a negative thought and don't follow it, you starve it. When you react emotionally, analyze it endlessly, or build stories around it, you feed it. The mind learns from repetition, not from logic. This is why simply knowing that a thought is irrational doesn't stop it from returning. What stops it is not engagement. Over time, with practice, the mind learns a new pattern. Thoughts still arise, but they pass more quickly. They no longer define you. They no longer control your behavior. Buddhism also teaches that many negative thoughts are rooted in fear. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy. The mind believes that constant self-criticism will protect you. It thinks that if it anticipates failure, it can avoid pain. This strategy backfires. Chronic negative thinking does not protect you. It weakens you. It drains energy, distorts perception, and creates suffering long before anything actually goes wrong. Positive thinking here means replacing fear-based habits with clarity-based ones. Instead of assuming the worst, you learn to stay with what is actually happening, not what might happen, not what happened before, just this moment. This does not make you naive, it makes you grounded. Another reason negative thoughts persist is identity. Over time, people begin to see themselves as anxious, unlucky, broken, or behind. These identities are built from repeated thoughts. Once an identity forms, the mind looks for evidence to support it and ignores evidence that contradicts it. Buddhism dismantles this by pointing out that there is no fixed self behind the thoughts. Thoughts change, moods change, circumstances change. Clinging to an identity based on thought is clinging to something unstable. When you stop saying "this is who I am" and start saying "this is what is arising," flexibility returns, and flexibility is the enemy of suffering. Training the mind away from negative habits is not quick. Buddhism never promises speed, it promises direction. Each time you notice a destructive thought without feeding it, you weaken the habit. Each time you choose a more balanced response, you strengthen a new path. Progress is subtle but real. Eventually, you begin to trust yourself differently, not because negative thoughts disappear, but because they no longer define your reality. You see them come and go like clouds, while awareness remains steady. This is how the mind stops destroying you, not by becoming silent, but by becoming honest. Negative thoughts lose power when they are seen for what they are: conditioned habits, not truths about who you are or what life is. And once you understand that, the mind becomes something you train, not something you obey. 3. A calm mind sees options. A panicked mind cannot. Buddhism is very clear about one thing most people learn too late. Panic makes you stupid, not weak, not unlucky. Stupid. A panicked mind cannot see clearly, cannot judge accurately, and cannot choose wisely. It narrows your vision until all you can see is threat, urgency, and fear. And when the mind is in that state, it almost always makes decisions that create more suffering later. This is not a moral failure. It is how the mind works when it is untrained. When something stressful happens, the mind reacts before you are even aware of it. The body tightens. Breathing becomes shallow. Thoughts speed up. The mind starts shouting instructions. Act now. Defend yourself. Escape. Say something. Do something. This reaction feels necessary, even intelligent. In reality, it is survival mode. And survival mode is not designed for wisdom. It is designed for immediate response. Buddhism teaches that most of the problems people regret were created in this state. Words spoken in anger, decisions made in fear, attachments formed out of loneliness, escapes chosen to avoid discomfort. In the moment, they felt justified. Later, they felt costly. A calm mind works differently. It does not rush. It does not exaggerate. It does not collapse possibilities into extremes. It stays open long enough to see more than one option. That openness is power. Positive thinking here does not mean forcing calm by pretending nothing is wrong. That is suppression, and suppression always leaks. Real calm comes from understanding impermanence and letting reactions pass instead of obeying them. In Buddhism, calm is not passivity, it is stability. A stable mind can respond instead of react. Reaction is automatic, response is chosen. Think about moments in your life when you handled a difficult situation well. Chances are, you were not panicked. You may have been serious, focused, even intense, but not mentally chaotic. That clarity allowed you to see consequences, timing, and alternatives. Now think about moments you regret. The pattern is usually the opposite: tight chest, racing thoughts, tunnel vision, a need to act immediately, panic disguised as certainty. The Buddha emphasized practices like mindfulness and breath awareness for this reason, not to make you peaceful for its own sake, but to slow the mind enough to see reality accurately. When the mind slows, perception sharpens. A calm mind notices details, a panicked mind misses. Tone instead of insult, timing instead of urgency, context instead of assumption. These details change outcomes. Another important point Buddhism makes is that calmness is not dependent on circumstances. It is a trained capacity. People often say, "I'll be calm when things settle down." That day rarely comes. Calm must be developed before chaos, not after it. If your mind is only calm when life is easy, it is not trained, it is conditional. Buddhism trains unconditional calm, not permanent calm, but recoverable calm. You still get disturbed. You just don't stay disturbed. Positive thinking here means trusting that you do not need to react immediately. The mind lies about urgency. It makes everything feel like an emergency. In reality, very few things require instant response. Most situations improve when given space. Silence is often the most intelligent response. Delay is often the most skillful action. The calm mind understands this and is not afraid of pauses. It knows that not acting is also an action. Another way calmness saves you is by protecting you from false certainty. Panic makes you confident in bad conclusions. Calm makes you curious. Curiosity opens options. Certainty closes them. When the mind is calm, it asks better questions. What am I actually responding to? What am I assuming? What happens if I wait? What outcome am I trying to protect? These questions do not arise in a panicked state. Panic only asks one question: how do I make this feeling stop? And that is how people sabotage themselves. They choose short-term relief over long-term clarity. Buddhism repeatedly warns against making decisions to escape discomfort. Discomfort is temporary. The consequences of escaping it poorly are not. A calm mind can sit with discomfort without being controlled by it. That ability alone changes everything. You stop chasing relief and start choosing wisely. Calmness also allows compassion to function. When the mind is panicked, it becomes self-centered. Everything is about you, your threat, your pain. When calm returns, perspective widens. You see other people's limitations, confusion, and fear. This doesn't mean you excuse harm. It means you respond without hatred. Hatred clouds judgment. Calm clears it. Another critical insight from Buddhism is that calmness must be practiced in small moments, not only during crises. How you respond to minor annoyances trains how you respond to major ones. If you lose control over small frustrations, you will lose control when it matters. Every time you pause instead of reacting, you strengthen the mind's ability to remain calm under pressure. This is training, not theory. Over time, the difference becomes obvious. Situations that once overwhelmed you no longer do. Not because life is easier, but because your mind is stronger. A calm mind does not guarantee success, but it drastically reduces self-inflicted damage, and most suffering comes from self-inflicted damage. Buddhism does not promise a life without difficulty. It promises a mind that can meet difficulty without collapsing. That is real positive thinking, not optimism, not denial, stability. When the mind is calm, it becomes your greatest ally. When it is panicked, it becomes your most dangerous enemy. The work is simple, but not easy. Slow the mind, observe the reaction, choose the response. Do this consistently, and you will start seeing options where before you only saw walls. That is how the mind saves you. 4. What you feed your mind becomes your reality. Buddhism is blunt about this. Your mind becomes the shape of what you repeatedly consume, not what you believe you consume, not what you intend to consume, but what you actually expose yourself to day after day. Thoughts, conversations, media, memories, inner dialogue, all of it feeds the mind. And the mind does not stay neutral. It absorbs, imitates, and reproduces. Most people think reality shapes their thoughts. Buddhism flips that around. Your thoughts shape how reality appears to you. Two people can live in the same city, under the same conditions, and experience completely different worlds. One sees hostility everywhere. The other sees opportunity and connection. The environment is the same. The mental diet is different. The mind is not passive. It is selective. Once it gets used to a certain type of input, it starts searching for it automatically. Feed it fear, and it will scan for threats. Feed it resentment, and it will look for reasons to be offended. Feed it gratitude, and it will notice stability and support. This happens whether you like it or not. That is why people who constantly consume negative information often believe the world is collapsing, even when their personal life is stable. And people who constantly replay past pain often feel wounded, even when nothing is currently harming them. The mind doesn't distinguish between what is happening now and what is being mentally replayed. To the nervous system, repeated thought is experience. Buddhism emphasizes mindfulness not as a spiritual luxury, but as mental hygiene. Just as you would not eat spoiled food daily and expect physical health, you cannot consume mental garbage constantly and expect clarity. Yet, this is exactly what most people do without questioning it. They start the day with comparison. They scroll through anxiety. They replay old conversations. They rehearse future conflicts that may never happen. Then they wonder why they feel tense, dissatisfied, and exhausted. The cause is not mysterious. It is repetition. Positive thinking in Buddhism does not mean forcing cheerful thoughts into the mind. It means becoming responsible for what you allow to stay there. You cannot stop every thought from arising, but you can choose which ones you entertain. Attention is the gatekeeper. Whatever you repeatedly give attention to grows. Whatever you ignore weakens. This is not philosophy. It is conditioning. The mind learns through exposure, not instruction. You can tell yourself to be calm all day, but if you constantly feed the mind urgency, outrage, and self-criticism, calm will never stabilize. The inputs are stronger than the intentions. This is why Buddhism places such importance on right attention. Not everything deserves your focus. Some thoughts arise only to drain you. Some memories replay only to reopen wounds. Some information is technically true, but psychologically toxic. Wisdom is knowing the difference. Another uncomfortable truth Buddhism points out is that many people are addicted to negativity, not consciously, but emotionally. Negativity gives the ego something to chew on. Complaints create identity. Drama creates stimulation. Victimhood creates meaning. Letting go of these patterns can feel empty at first, because the mind is used to constant friction. But peace feels empty only to a mind addicted to noise. When you reduce negative inputs, the mind may initially resist. It may feel bored, restless, or uneasy. This is withdrawal. The habit is losing fuel. If you persist, a quieter form of clarity begins to appear. The mind becomes less reactive, less cluttered, more spacious. Buddhism teaches that reality is filtered through perception. Change the filter, and the same life feels different. This is not self-deception, it is perceptual accuracy. A mind overloaded with negativity distorts reality just as much as blind optimism does. Positive thinking here means feeding the mind with what leads to clarity, not comfort. Sometimes clarity is uncomfortable. Sometimes it means facing responsibility. Sometimes it means letting go of narratives that justified your pain. But clarity always reduces unnecessary suffering. Another aspect of mental feeding is inner speech. The way you talk to yourself matters more than how others talk to you, because you are always listening. If your inner voice is harsh, dismissive, or threatening, the mind remains in a state of stress even when nothing external is wrong. Buddhism encourages compassionate awareness not as kindness for its own sake, but because aggression toward yourself keeps the nervous system in fight mode. A mind in fight mode cannot rest, reflect, or see options clearly. Changing inner speech does not mean lying to yourself. It means speaking truth without cruelty, firm without abuse, honest without humiliation. Over time, this changes how reality feels. The same challenges appear, but they no longer feel like attacks. They feel like problems to be worked with. Another hidden input is association. The people you spend time with shape your mental world. Conversations filled with blame, gossip, and constant dissatisfaction train the mind to see life through that lens. Buddhism advises mindful companionship because the mind is impressionable. This does not mean isolating yourself or judging others. It means noticing how different environments affect your mental state. If your mind consistently deteriorates after certain interactions, that is information. Ignoring it is self-neglect. The mind becomes what it repeatedly engages with. This applies to everything: thoughts, people, content, even silence. Silence itself is a powerful input. When the mind is not constantly stimulated, it begins to settle. In that settling, insight appears naturally. You start seeing which thoughts are useful and which are just noise. You regain choice. Most people never experience this because they never stop feeding the mind. Buddhism does not ask you to control the world. It asks you to be selective with the mind. That alone changes your lived experience dramatically. If you want to know why your reality feels heavy, look at what you repeatedly consume mentally. Not once, not occasionally, daily. Change the diet, and the mind changes. Change the mind, and reality changes with it. This is not motivational talk. It is cause and effect. Feed the mind wisely, and it becomes a place of refuge. Feed it carelessly, and it becomes a source of constant suffering. The choice is subtle, but relentless, and it is being made every moment you give your attention to something. Choose carefully. 5. The ego thrives on negative thinking. Buddhism exposes something most people never realize about their suffering. Much of it is not caused by events, but by the ego's need to protect and reinforce a story about me. The ego is not your personality. It is the mental structure that constantly asks, "What does this say about me?" And negative thinking is its favorite fuel. Whenever something goes wrong, the ego rushes in to interpret it. If you are criticized, the ego hears humiliation. If you are ignored, it hears rejection. If you fail, it hears proof of inadequacy. The ego does not care about accuracy, it cares about identity. And negative thinking strengthens that identity by keeping the spotlight fixed on a wounded sense of self. This is why negative thoughts feel personal. They are designed to be. The ego survives by making everything about you. It says, "They disrespected you. You were treated unfairly. You are falling behind." Each of these thoughts tightens the sense of a separate self that must be defended, compared, and validated. Buddhism teaches that this constant self-referencing is the root of mental suffering. The more you identify with every thought and emotion, the more fragile you become. Every challenge feels like an attack. Every setback feels like a verdict. Life becomes exhausting because the ego never rests. Negative thinking keeps the ego busy. It gives it enemies, regrets, and future fears to chew on. Without negativity, the ego weakens. That is why the mind often resists letting go of painful thoughts. On some level, suffering feels familiar. It gives the ego a sense of importance. I am the one who was wronged. I am the one who struggles. I am the one who never gets a break. These identities may feel heavy, but they are still identities. Letting them go can feel like losing yourself, even when they are hurting you. Positive thinking in Buddhism is not about inflating the ego with false confidence. That would only strengthen it in a different direction. Buddhism does not replace "I am worthless" with "I am special." Both are ego statements. One is self-hatred. the other is self-attachment. Instead, Buddhism asks a more radical question. Who is the I that these thoughts are talking about? When you observe the mind closely, you notice something unsettling. Thoughts about me appear and disappear just like any other thought. Emotions rise and fall, moods shift. There is no solid, permanent self behind them. There is awareness, watching the process. This realization weakens the ego at its root. When you stop identifying with every negative thought, the ego loses authority. A thought arises saying, "You're failing." Instead of collapsing into it, you see it as a mental event. The ego wants you to believe the thought is you. Awareness sees it as something passing through. This is the difference between suffering and freedom. Negative thinking also fuels comparison, another core ego activity. The ego constantly measures who is ahead, who is behind, who is respected, who is ignored. Comparison creates dissatisfaction even when nothing is actually wrong. Someone else's success becomes your failure. Someone else's happiness becomes evidence that you are missing out. Buddhism calls this a trap because comparison never ends. There is always someone richer, smarter, more attractive, or more admired. If your peace depends on comparison, peace is impossible. When negative thinking drops, comparison weakens. When comparison weakens, the ego loses leverage. You begin to experience life directly instead of through a scoreboard. Another way the ego thrives on negative thinking is through blame. If something hurts, the ego wants a target. Sometimes it blames others, sometimes it blames you. Both keep the ego alive by reinforcing a narrative of conflict. Blame feels powerful, but it traps you in the past. It locks your attention on what should have been different instead of what can be done now. Buddhism teaches responsibility without blame. Responsibility empowers. Blame paralyzes. When negative thinking softens, responsibility becomes possible. You stop asking, "Who is at fault?" and start asking, "What is skillful now?" This shift moves you out of ego drama and into clarity. The ego also uses negative thinking to predict the future. It assumes past pain will repeat. It projects failure, rejection, and loss before anything happens. These predictions feel protective, but they create anxiety without providing solutions. Buddhism emphasizes impermanence. To break this pattern, the future is not fixed. Thoughts about it are guesses, not prophecies. When you stop trusting every fearful prediction, the ego loses another tool. Positive thinking here means humility, not shrinking yourself, but recognizing the limits of your mental stories. You admit that the mind does not know everything. That humility creates space. In that space, peace appears naturally. As the ego weakens, something surprising happens. You don't become passive or indifferent. You become lighter. Problems still arise, but they are no longer personal attacks. They are situations to be understood and responded to. Compassion increases, not because you force it, but because the ego's defenses are no longer blocking it. You see that others are also driven by fear, habit, and confusion. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it reduces hatred, and hatred is heavy. Buddhism does not aim to destroy the ego violently. It aims to starve it gently by removing identification. When you stop feeding it negative thinking, it loses strength. When it loses strength, suffering decreases. This process is gradual. The ego will return again and again, demanding attention. Each time you notice it without obeying it, you weaken it. Over time, you realize something important. Peace does not come from fixing the ego's story. When negative thinking no longer defines who you are, the mind becomes spacious. Life feels less like a battle and more like a flow of experiences. Some pleasant, some painful, none requiring a permanent identity. That is freedom in the Buddhist sense. Not becoming someone better, but loosening the grip of the story about who you think you are. And when the ego stops feeding on negativity, the mind finally becomes quiet enough to rest. 6. Consistent thoughts shape your character. Buddhism makes a claim that is both empowering and uncomfortable. You are not defined by your intentions or your occasional efforts, but by what your mind repeatedly returns to. Character is not built in dramatic moments. It is built quietly, through the thoughts you rehearse every day. Long before your behavior becomes visible, it is formed internally. Most people think of character as something fixed. Buddhism sees it as something conditioned. What you consistently think becomes what you consistently feel. What you consistently feel becomes how you act. And how you act, repeated over time, becomes who you are. This means your character is not fate, it is momentum. A person who repeatedly thinks in terms of patience becomes patient without effort. A person who repeatedly thinks in terms of resentment becomes bitter without noticing. This happens slowly enough that people rarely see it happening to themselves, but clearly enough that others can see it in them. Buddhism emphasizes intention, because intention is the seed of action. Every action begins as a thought. Not every thought becomes an action, but every action was once a thought. The quality of your thinking, therefore, matters more than any single decision you make under pressure. Positive thinking here does not mean imagining success or repeating affirmations. Buddhism is not interested in fantasy. It is interested in training the mind to incline towards skillful states. Skillful thoughts are those that reduce harm and increase clarity. Unskillful thoughts do the opposite. When your mind repeatedly rehearses anger, anger becomes familiar. When it rehearses suspicion, suspicion becomes automatic. When it rehearses gratitude, gratitude becomes natural. The mind does not argue with what it repeats. It accepts it as normal. This is why people often say, "That's just how I am." Buddhism challenges that statement directly. That is how you have practiced. And anything practiced can be practiced differently. One of the most overlooked aspects of character is how you respond when no one is watching. Your private thoughts shape your public actions more than you realize. If your inner world is harsh, impatient, or cynical, it will leak into how you treat others, even when you try to hide it. Buddhism teaches that ethical behavior is not enforced by rules alone. It arises naturally from a trained mind. When the mind is calm and clear, harmful actions feel uncomfortable. When the mind is agitated and confused, harmful actions feel justified. This is why moral effort without mental training often fails. You can promise yourself to act better, but if your thoughts remain undisciplined, those promises collapse under pressure. Consistent thinking also shapes how you handle difficulty. A mind trained toward responsibility looks for learning. A mind trained toward blame looks for enemies. A mind trained toward patience waits for the right moment. A mind trained toward urgency rushes and regrets. These patterns become your reputation, not because you chose them once, but because you repeated them many times. Buddhism highlights this to return power to you. If character is built through repetition, then change is possible through repetition as well. Not through force, but through redirection. Each time you notice a destructive thought and choose not to feed it, you interrupt an old pattern. Each time you intentionally cultivate a more balanced thought, you strengthen a new one. This is slow work. There are no shortcuts. But it is reliable. The mind resists this at first because habits feel safe, even when they are harmful. The familiar feels predictable, the unfamiliar feels risky, but as new patterns stabilize, the mind adjusts. Over time, effort decreases. What once required discipline becomes natural. You no longer have to remind yourself to pause, to listen, or to consider consequences. The mind does it automatically. This is how wisdom becomes embodied rather than intellectual. Buddhism also teaches that character shapes destiny, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Your character determines the situations you create, the relationships you maintain, and the opportunities you can handle. A reactive character creates chaos. A stable character creates trust. People respond to the character you project, not the intentions you claim. This feedback loop reinforces who you become. Positive thinking here means aligning your thoughts with the kind of life you want to live, not the image you want to present. It means asking, if this thought became habitual, who would I become? That question alone filters many unskillful patterns. This also explains why temporary motivation rarely leads to lasting change. Motivation spikes and fades. Character remains. Buddhism focuses on consistency, not intensity. You do not need to think perfectly. You need to think responsibly, again and again. Eventually, you reach a point where the mind becomes an ally. It no longer constantly undermines your efforts. It supports them. Discipline feels less like restraint and more like freedom. When consistent thoughts shape your character, life becomes simpler, not easier, but simpler. You know how you will respond. Others know what to expect from you. Trust builds, internally and externally. This is not about becoming flawless. It is about becoming reliable. And reliability is a form of peace. Buddhism does not ask you to change who you are overnight. It asks you to pay attention to what you repeatedly think, because that is where character is being built, whether you are aware of it or not. Train that quietly, and everything else follows. 7. Liberation begins in the mind. Buddhism ends where most people never think to begin. Freedom is not something you earn from the world. It is something you uncover in the mind. This is difficult to accept because it removes excuses. It means peace is not waiting on better conditions, better people, or a better version of your past. It means the key has always been internal. Most people live with a silent belief that says, once this changes, I'll be okay. Once I succeed, once I'm respected, once I'm healed, once life becomes fair. Buddhism calls this belief a trap, not because improvement is bad, but because tying peace to conditions guarantees suffering. Conditions are unstable, they always change. If your peace depends on them, it will collapse again and again. Liberation in Buddhism does not mean escaping life. It means escaping unnecessary mental bondage, bondage to craving, bondage to resistance, bondage to identity, bondage to the belief that things must be different for you to be at peace. The mind creates a constant checklist for happiness. When I get this, I'll relax. When that stops, I'll be calm. When they change, I'll feel free. The checklist never ends. Every item completed is replaced by another. This is why people reach goals and still feel empty. The mind simply moves the finish line. Buddhism identifies craving as the engine of this cycle. Craving is not just wanting pleasant things, it is the insistence that reality must conform to your preferences. When it doesn't, suffering arises. When it does, fear of loss arises. Either way, the mind is unsettled. Liberation begins when you see this clearly, not intellectually, but directly. You notice how the mind tightens around desires, and resists discomfort. You see how that tightening feels, and you begin to understand that the tension itself is optional. Positive thinking here does not mean expecting life to be pleasant. It means trusting that you can meet life as it is without collapsing. That trust weakens craving. When craving weakens, suffering loosens its grip. Another major barrier to liberation is attachment to identity. The mind constantly says, "This is who I am: successful, broken, victim, strong, weak." Buddhism challenges every one of these labels, not to erase your personality, but to stop you from imprisoning yourself inside a story. Identities feel solid, but they are built from thoughts and memories. They change depending on mood, environment, and circumstance. When you cling to an identity, you suffer whenever life contradicts it. If you identify as strong, weakness terrifies you. If you identify as kind, anger shames you. If you identify as successful, failure humiliates you. Liberation begins when you see that you are not required to defend an identity. You are allowed to experience whatever arises without turning it into me. This is not detachment from life. It is detachment from false ownership. Buddhism teaches that awareness itself is free. Thoughts come and go, emotions rise and fall, sensations change, but awareness remains present through all of it. When you shift identification from the content of the mind to the awareness of it, something profound happens. You stop being dragged by every mental movement. Pain may still arise, but it doesn't define you. Fear may still appear, but it doesn't control you. Joy may come, but you don't cling to it desperately. Everything becomes workable. This is liberation in real time, not in theory. Another crucial insight is impermanence. Everything changes. This is not meant to depress you. It is meant to free you. When you truly understand impermanence, you stop gripping tightly. You stop demanding guarantees from life. You stop asking moments to last forever. Suffering often comes from trying to freeze what is fluid. When the mind accepts impermanence, it relaxes. Loss hurts, but it doesn't shatter you. Pleasure is enjoyed, but not hoarded. Life is experienced more fully because it is no longer being negotiated. Liberation also means ending resistance to inner experience. Most people spend enormous energy fighting their own thoughts and emotions. I shouldn't feel this. This shouldn't be happening. I need this to stop. That resistance doubles suffering. Buddhism teaches allowing without indulgence. You let thoughts and emotions arise without feeding them or suppressing them. You allow pain without dramatizing it. You allow joy without clinging to it. When resistance ends, struggle ends. What remains is clarity. This is why Buddhism places so much emphasis on mindfulness, not as a technique to feel good, but as a way to see clearly. When you see clearly, the mind stops creating imaginary problems. Liberation does not mean the absence of difficulty. It means the absence of unnecessary struggle. The mind saves you when it understands this, when it stops demanding that reality meet its expectations, when it stops clinging to stories about who you are, when it stops chasing permanent satisfaction in temporary things. At that point, peace is no longer something you pursue. It is something that appears when grasping ends. This does not make you passive. It makes you effective. Action taken from clarity is cleaner than action taken from desperation. Love expressed without attachment is steadier than love driven by fear. Work done without ego is more sustainable than work fueled by insecurity. Buddhism does not promise that life will become easy. It promises that you will stop making it harder than it already is. Liberation begins quietly. In moments when you notice a thought and don't follow it, In moments when you accept discomfort without resistance, in moments when you stop asking life to justify itself, over time, those moments accumulate. The mind loosens, space opens, peace becomes familiar. Not because the world changed, but because the mind finally stopped fighting it. That is the end of the path and the beginning of freedom. And it starts, as it always has, in the mind. Everything you've heard comes down to one truth. Buddhism never softens. Your mind is the battlefield, not life, not people, not circumstances. The mind is either trained or it runs wild. And an untrained mind does not rest. It replays the past, fears the future, clings to identity, and demands guarantees that life will never give. You don't suffer because life is cruel. You suffer because the mind insists on control where there is none, permanence where there is change, and certainty where there is uncertainty. This is not a message of blame. It is a message of power. The moment you see how the mind creates suffering, you also see how it can end it. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily, thought by thought, reaction by reaction, attachment by attachment. Freedom is not somewhere else. It is not later. It is not earned by becoming a different person. It appears the moment you stop believing every thought, stop feeding every fear, and stop turning temporary experiences into permanent identities. Train the mind, and it will protect you even in hardship. Ignore it, and it will torment you even in comfort. The choice is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, every time a thought arises, and you decide whether to follow it or let it pass. That is where your life is being shaped. And that is where your freedom begins.